The kind of courage most people miss. I didn't notice your courage the way people usually notice things. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, it didn't demand attention. That's probably why most people missed it. But I didn't, because the kind of courage you carry doesn't look like confidence. It looks like restraint. Like choosing honesty when silence would have been easier. Like staying present when leaving would have felt safer. Like standing still in moments where most people rush to protect themselves. That kind of courage doesn't show up in achievements or applause. It shows up in how someone behaves when no one is watching. I saw it in the way you didn't react impulsively. In moments where emotion would have justified distance, you chose clarity instead. You didn't escalate. You didn't dramatize. You didn't turn discomfort into performance. You stayed grounded. That takes courage most people don't develop. There's a version of strength the world celebrates. Decisive, dominant, yielding. And then there's the version that actually changes things. The one that listens before it speaks. The one that pauses before it assumes. The one that chooses alignment over advantage. That's the courage I saw in you. You didn't run from uncertainty. You sat with it. You didn't demand reassurance. You trusted yourself enough to wait. And that trust, quiet, unspoken, internal, is rare. Most people confuse courage with certainty. They think brave people know exactly what they're doing. They don't. Brave people act without guarantees. They choose integrity even when outcomes are unclear. That's what you did. I noticed it in the way you didn't need to be right. You needed to be real. You didn't protect your ego. You protected the connection. And that told me something important. You value truth more than control. Control is easy. It comes from fear. Courage comes from presence. And presence was something you never lacked. There were moments where you could have closed off. Moments where withdrawing would have been understandable. Moments where self-protection would have looked like strength to everyone else. But you didn't choose that. You chose openness, not recklessness. Openness with boundaries. That's not something you learn accidentally. That's something life teaches you after it breaks you just enough to show you what matters. I realized something quietly as I watched you move through those moments. Your courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being honest without demanding safety first. Most people want certainty before they speak. You were willing to speak without knowing how it would land. Not to provoke, to align. That alignment changed how I saw everything. Not because you impressed me, because you revealed yourself. There's a difference between impressing someone and being seen by them. Impression fades. Being seen stays. I didn't see courage in a single moment. I saw it in consistency. In the way you kept choosing the hard right over the easier wrong. In the way you didn't let fear dictate tone. In the way you stayed respectful even when you had every reason not to. That consistency told me something about your character. Not who you try to be. Who you are when pressure arrives. Pressure reveals patterns. And your pattern was integrity. You didn't posture, you didn't perform, you didn't try to control outcomes. You showed up fully, and then you let go of what wasn't yours to manage. That's courage most people don't recognize because it doesn't advertise itself, it doesn't seek validation, it doesn't need acknowledgement. But I saw it, and once you see that kind of courage, you can't unsee it. It made me reflect on myself. On the moments I chose convenience over truth, on the times I mistook silence for peace, on the ways I've learned to protect myself instead of showing up. Your courage didn't shame me, it challenged me. There's a difference. Shame closes people. Challenge opens them. And your presence opened something in me I didn't realize had been dormant. I started asking myself harder questions. Am I living aligned with what I value? Am I choosing comfort too often? Am I avoiding moments that ask me to be honest? Those questions didn't come from pressure. They came from example. That's how real courage works. It doesn't demand change. It invites it. I didn't walk away from witnessing your courage feeling intimidated. I felt clearer. Clearer about what kind of partnership I want. Clearer about the kind of partnership I want to be beside. Clearer about what matters when life stops being theoretical. Courage like yours doesn't disappear when things get difficult. It becomes the anchor. I realized something else. The reason your courage stood out so clearly is because it wasn't reactive. It wasn't fueled by emotion. It wasn't performative. It was rooted. Rooted courage doesn't flinch. It doesn't need to prove itself. It just stands where it is. You didn't ask to be seen this way. That's what made it real. I didn't label you brave in a moment. I felt it later. In reflection. in the quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. What changed wasn't how I felt about you. What changed was the depth of it. Surface connection is easy. Depth requires courage. And you demonstrated it without trying. That's why it changed everything. Not dramatically, permanently. Because once you see someone choose truth over comfort consistently, you stop questioning their character. You stop wondering how they'll show up when things get hard. You already know. I didn't need reassurance from you. Your actions provided clarity. And clarity is rare. It doesn't arrive through words, it arrives through behavior. I saw your courage, not once, repeatedly, and it reshaped how I understand trust. Trust isn't built when things are easy. It's built when people choose integrity in uncomfortable moments. You chose it, quietly, without asking for recognition. That's why it mattered. That's why it changed everything. This isn't a story about bravery. It's a recognition of character. And once character reveals itself, everything else reorganizes around it. What it revealed about who you are. When no one is watching, the thing about courage like yours is that it doesn't announce itself in moments designed to be remembered. It shows up in the ordinary spaces, in the pauses, in the choices that don't get witnessed or awarded. And that's where I really began to see it. I saw it in the way you didn't need to explain yourself excessively. Most people do that when they're unsure, they over-justify, they over-communicate. They talk not to be understood, but to be safe. You didn't. You trusted your intentions enough to let your words stand without cushioning them. That takes courage. The kind that comes from self-respect. And notice how you didn't rush to fill silence. Silence makes most people uncomfortable. It feels like vulnerability without protection. So they rush to speak, to clarify, to soften. You didn't treat silence like an enemy. You let it breathe. And that told me something important. You don't panic when things aren't immediately resolved. You trust that clarity doesn't need force. I watched how you handled uncertainty, not with detachment, not with control, but with steadiness. Uncertainty exposes people. It shows who needs reassurance and who can stand without it. You stood. You didn't confuse patience with passivity. You were patient without disappearing, present without pressing. That balance is rare. Most people either push or pull away. You stayed. And staying, truly staying, requires courage because it leaves you visible. I saw how you didn't weaponize your emotions. You felt them, but you didn't use them to gain leverage or sympathy. You didn't dramatize pain to justify behavior. You didn't escalate to feel powerful. You carried emotion responsibly. That's not something people are taught. It's something they earn through experience. There was a moment where you could have chosen self-protection and no one would have blamed you. Withdrawal would have been understandable. Distance would have made sense. Silence would have been the easier route. But you chose presence instead, not because it felt good, because it felt right. That's when I understood something. Your courage isn't situational. It's structural. It's built into how you move through the world. I realized you don't perform strength. You live it quietly. And quiet strength doesn't exhaust itself trying to prove anything. I noticed how you didn't react to pressure with defensiveness. Defensiveness is fear dressed as logic. You didn't dress fear up. You acknowledged it without letting it lead. You didn't turn moments into tests. You didn't ask for guarantees. You didn't demand clarity on your timeline. You trusted the process enough to let it unfold. That trust wasn't naive. It was grounded. I also noticed how you didn't shrink yourself to keep things comfortable. You didn't soften your truth to avoid tension. You didn't abandon yourself to maintain harmony. You remained honest without being harsh. That's not an easy line to walk. Most people swing between silence and aggression. You stayed centered, and center takes work. I realized then that your courage wasn't born from confidence. It was born from alignment. Alignment between who you are internally and how you show up externally. There was no split, no performance gap. That alignment changes everything. Because when someone is aligned, you don't have to guess how they'll respond under pressure. You already know. I started reflecting on my own patterns, on how often people, myself included, avoid moments that require presence because presence feels exposed. Your willingness to stay present without control forced me to confront that habit, not defensively. honestly. Your courage didn't demand admiration, it invited reflection. And reflection is far more powerful. I began to understand something deeper. The reason your courage stood out wasn't because it was extraordinary. It was because it was consistent. Consistency is what reveals character. Anyone can be brave once. Few people are brave quietly, repeatedly, without witnesses. You were. I noticed how you didn't need to be the center of resolution. You didn't need to steer outcomes. You allowed things to resolve without manipulation. That level of trust isn't passive, it's disciplined. Discipline is choosing restraint when reaction would feel justified. You chose restraint without suppressing yourself. That's the difference. I saw how you respected boundaries, yours and mine, without using them as walls. Boundaries didn't isolate you, they grounded you. That's a sign of emotional maturity. You didn't overshare to feel close. You didn't withhold to feel safe. You shared with intention. That intentionality told me you know the value of your inner world. Most people give too much or too little. You gave what was true. I realized something important. Your courage wasn't reactive. It wasn't born from conflict. It existed before conflict ever arrived. And that means it wasn't situational. It was foundational. That changed how I saw the future. Because courage that only appears when convenient disappears when things get difficult. Yours didn't. I saw how you handled yourself when outcomes were uncertain. You didn't bargain. You didn't posture. You didn't attempt to control perception. You trusted yourself enough to let reality do its work. That kind of self-trust can't be faked. It's built through keeping promises to yourself, through walking away from what isn't aligned, through choosing truth even when it costs something. Your courage carried the weight of experience, not trauma. Experience. There's a difference. Trauma creates reaction. Experience creates reaction wean. And wisdom shows up as calm in moments that would rattle others. You were calm, not detached, centered. That calm wasn't cold. It was warm, present, attentive. I noticed how you listened. Not to respond, not to fix, but to understand. Listening like that requires courage because it means surrendering control of the narrative. You were afraid of what you might hear. I saw how you didn't measure yourself against expectations. You measured yourself against integrity, and integrity is an internal standard, not an external one. That internal standard guided you, quietly, reliably. I realized something that shifted my perspective completely. Your courage wasn't about facing fear. It was about refusing to abandon yourself. That's the hardest thing to do. Most people abandon themselves slowly, in compromises, in silence, in tolerating misalignment. You didn't. You stayed with yourself, even when it would have been easier not to. That told me something I didn't need confirmation for. You're not someone who disappears when things get real. You're someone who shows up. I didn't need to ask how you'd handle future difficulty. I already saw it. That recognition didn't feel dramatic. It felt settling, like something clicked into place. I understood then why this changed everything, not because it altered how I felt, but because it clarified how deeply I could trust what I felt. Trust isn't built through words, it's built through behavior over time, and your behavior spoke without trying. I saw your courage, not as a moment, as a pattern. Patterns don't lie, and once you recognize a pattern like that, you stop questioning character, you stop second-guessing intentions, you stop bracing for collapse, because I knew. Your courage didn't make things louder. It made them clearer, clear enough to see that what we're building isn't fragile. It's grounded, clear enough to understand that this connection isn't fueled by intensity. It's fueled by intensity. That's what changed everything, not the moment, the consistency. And once you see someone's courage at that level, lived, not declared, you don't look at them the same way again. You look at them with respect, with trust, with certainty that when things matter most, they won't disappear. That's what I saw. And once I saw it, nothing felt uncertain anymore, how it redefined what strength means to me. There was a moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, where I realized something had shifted inside me. Not because of something you said, not because of something you asked for, not because of anything you tried to prove. It shifted because I finally understood what I had been witnessing all along. Your courage didn't just show me who you are, it redefined what strength means to me. I grew up around a version of strength that was loud, strength that asserted itself, strength that dominated conversations, strength that demanded outcomes, the kind of strength that moves quickly and leaves little room for uncertainty. For a long time, I respected that version, even admired it. But watching you, I realized something uncomfortable and necessary. That version of strength is incomplete. What you showed me was something quieter. Strength that doesn't need momentum to feel valid. Strength that doesn't escalate when things get uncomfortable. Strength that doesn't confuse control with confidence. Strength that can pause. Pausing is risky. When you pause, you're exposed. You don't get to hide behind reaction or certainty. You have to sit with what's real. And that's what you did. I noticed how you didn't rush to define things. Most people rush because uncertainty feels threatening. They label, categorize, decide. Not because it's time, but because they're uncomfortable not knowing. You were willing to not know. And that willingness was powerful. You didn't rush to secure outcomes. You trusted process. Not blindly, intentionally. I realized then that real strength doesn't try to eliminate uncertainty. It learns how to stand inside it without losing integrity. You stood there, calm, aware, unmoving. There was a moment where I felt something I didn't expect. Relief. Not relief that something was resolved. Relief that I didn't need to brace myself. You weren't going to explode. You weren't going to disappear. You weren't going to twist the moment into something it wasn't. You were just going to stay. Staying is harder than leaving. Leaving gives you control. Staying requires trust. That trust didn't come from optimism. It came from alignment, from knowing who you are and refusing to abandon that even when it would have been easier. I started to realize how often strength is mistaken for speed. People admire decisiveness because it looks like confidence. But decisiveness without grounding is just movement. And movement without grounding eventually collapses. You work fast. You were steady. And steadiness lasts. Watching you, I saw how strength doesn't always push forward. Sometimes it holds the line. You didn't try to win moments. You didn't turn conversations into battles. You didn't need to be right. You needed to be honest. Honesty without defensiveness is one of the clearest signs of strength there is. It means you're not protecting an image. You're protecting your values. I noticed how you didn't shift when pressure increased. Pressure reveals fractures, or it reveals foundation. You didn't crack. You didn't harden. You remained open. That openness wasn't naive. It was discerning. You didn't overshare. You didn't collapse boundaries. You stayed available without becoming exposed. That balance is rare. It made me reflect on the way I've handled pressure in the past. How often I moved quickly to regain control. How often I equated decisiveness with leadership. How often I avoid sitting in moments that ask me to listen instead of direct. Your courage didn't criticize those patterns. It made them visible. And once something becomes visible, you can't unknow it. I realized that strength isn't about how forcefully you move. It's about how intentionally you stay. Staying with discomfort, staying with truth, staying with yourself. Most people leave themselves long before they leave a situation. They compromise internally. They silence instincts. They betray boundaries quietly. You didn't. And that refusal changed how I measure character. Character isn't revealed when things are clear. It's revealed when clarity hasn't arrived yet, and you still choose integrity. That's what you did, over and over. I also noticed how your courage didn't seek reassurance. You didn't need to be told you were doing the right thing. You trusted your internal compass. That trust is built, not given. It told me you don't rely on external validation to stay aligned. You rely on self-respect. Self-respect is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just holds. I saw that in you. And it made me rethink what kind of strength I want to live beside. I don't want strength that needs to dominate. I want strength that needs to dominate. I want strength that can hold space. Space for conversation. Space for uncertainty. Space for growth. You held that space without collapsing into it, without filling it unnecessarily, without controlling it. That kind of strength creates safety. Not because it protects, because it doesn't threaten. I realized that the reason your courage changed everything wasn't because it was impressive. It was because it was dependable. Dependable courage doesn't fluctuate with mood. It doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. It doesn't require conditions. It's there consistently. I started seeing the future differently. Not as something that needs to be managed, but as something that unfolds naturally when both people can stand in uncertainty without fear. Fear creates urgency. Urgency creates mistakes. Your courage removed urgency, and with it, pressure dissolved. I felt something else too. Respect. Not admiration. Respect. Admiration puts people on pedestals. Respect sees them clearly. I saw you clearly. And clarity creates trust. Trust isn't blind. It's informed. And What I saw informed me deeply. I didn't need you to promise anything. I didn't need reassurance about what you do in the future. Your presence already answered those questions. I knew that when things get difficult, and they will, you won't disappear. You won't panic. You won't compromise yourself to keep the peace. You'll show up, grounded, honest, present. That's strength I can build with. Your courage didn't just change how I see you. It changed how I see myself. It challenged me to slow down, to listen longer, to stay present instead of decisive. Not because decisiveness is wrong, because it's incomplete without grounding. I realized that real leadership in life and connection isn't about directing outcomes. It's about creating conditions where truth can surface safely. You did that naturally, without instruction, without agenda. That's when I understood why this mattered so deeply. Your courage wasn't situational. It wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't reactive. It was who you are. And once you see someone operate from that place, you don't question whether they'll grow. You know they will. Because growth is inevitable when someone refuses to abandon integrity. That realization didn't feel exciting, it felt peaceful. Peace comes when you stop needing to guess. I wasn't guessing anymore. Your courage didn't change everything loudly. It changed everything fundamentally. It shifted the ground I stand on. The way I assess moments, the way I interpret silence, the way I value patience, it taught me that strength isn't about certainty, it's about coherence. Coherence between thought, feeling, and action. And you were coherent. That coherence changed the tone of everything that followed. It slowed things down, deepened trust, removed unnecessary tension. And that's when I understood this wasn't just courage, it was character. Character doesn't need validation. It reveals itself. And once revealed, it redefines what you're willing to accept. I saw your courage, and because I did, I can't go back to valuing surface strength. I know what real strength looks like now. And it looks like you. Why it made me certain. Not afraid. There's a strange moment that happens when you finally recognize real courage. It doesn't make you feel excited. It doesn't make your heart race. It doesn't fill you with anticipation or fear. It does the opposite. It settles you. And that's when I knew something important had changed. Most people think certainty comes from answers, from conversations that end neatly, from plans that feel secure, from guarantees that remove doubt. But certainty doesn't come from any of that. It comes from witnessing character under pressure. And once you've seen that, fear loses its grip. Your courage didn't make me cautious. It made me calm. That's how I know it was real. Fear thrives on unpredictability. It feeds on inconsistency. It grows when you don't know which version of someone will show up when things get uncomfortable. I knew which version of you would show up. Because I already saw it. You didn't just show courage once. You showed it in moments where there was nothing to gain. No applause, no leverage, no outcome to secure. Just presence. That's what removed fear. Not because nothing could go wrong, but because I knew how you'd respond if it did. I realized that fear isn't about bad outcomes. It's about being alone in them. And watching you, I knew I wouldn't be alone. You didn't promise steadiness. You demonstrated it. And demonstration carries more weight than words ever could. I started thinking about the future differently, not in terms of scenarios, but in terms of partnership. Partnership isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about knowing you won't have to carry it by yourself. And your courage showed me exactly that. I didn't imagine you standing beside me when things were easy. That part was never in question. I imagined you standing there when clarity disappears, when timing is off, when answers don't arrive on schedule. And I knew you would. That knowledge didn't feel intense. It felt grounding, like standing on solid ground instead of constantly scanning for cracks. Most relationships are built on hope. Hope that things will go smoothly. Hope that communication will be enough. Hope that love will carry weight when life becomes heavy. Hope is fragile. What you gave me wasn't hope. It was evidence. Evidence that when things get uncomfortable, you don't react. You respond. And response requires presence. I realized then that fear had been quietly leaving the room, not because everything was resolved, but because trust had taken its place. Trust doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It makes uncertainty survivable. Watching you, I stopped imagining worst-case scenarios, not because I was naive, because they didn't scare me anymore. Fear needs chaos to survive. Your courage brought order, not control, order. You didn't impose direction, you created stability, and stability changes how you approach everything else. I also realized that courage like yours removes pressure. Pressure to rush, pressure to define things prematurely, pressure to secure outcomes. That pressure wasn't necessary anymore. When pressure disappears, truth has space to surface. And truth is always calmer than fear expects it to be. I noticed how differently I began to show up. I wasn't guarding myself. I wasn't bracing. I wasn't anticipating collapse. I was simply present. Presence became natural instead of effortful. That's a sign of safety. Safety isn't created by reassurance. It's created by consistency, and consistency is what you offered without trying. I saw how you handled not being in control. That's where fear usually shows up. But you didn't grasp for control, you trusted process. And trust doesn't come from optimism. It comes from self-knowledge. You knew who you were. And because you knew that, you didn't need to manage perception. You didn't need to steer a narrative. You let reality unfold. That's what made me certain. Not of outcomes, of alignment. Alignment between who you are and how you act. Alignment between your values and your behavior. Alignment between your inner world and the way you move through moments that matter. Misalignment creates fear. Alignment dissolves it. I realized how often fear in relationships isn't about the other person. It's about inconsistency, about unpredictability, about not knowing which version of someone will appear when things get real. I knew which version of you would appear, and that knowledge was enough. I didn't feel the need to protect myself. Protection is a response to threat. I didn't feel threatened. I felt supported, even without words. Your courage didn't make promises. It created a track record, and track records create certainty. I didn't need to imagine how you'd handle conflict. I saw how you handled tension, and tension is more revealing than conflict ever could be. Conflict has rules. Tension doesn't. You didn't avoid tension. You stayed with it. That's where most people disappear. I realized then that fear had always been tied to abandonment, not physical. Emotional. The fear that when things get uncomfortable, someone will leave, even if they stay physically present. You didn't leave. Not emotionally, not energetically, not internally. That's when fear stopped making sense. I also understood something deeper. Courage like yours doesn't just make relationships safer, it makes growth possible. Growth requires friction, moments of discomfort, conversations that don't resolve neatly, and those moments only work when both people can remain grounded. You were grounded, and that meant growth wouldn't destroy us, it would refine us. I didn't feel the need to slow down out of caution. I slowed down out of respect. There's a difference. Respect says this matters enough to move deliberately. Fear says this is dangerous, tread carefully. I wasn't afraid. I was attentive. Your courage invited that attentiveness. It didn't demand it. I also noticed that I stopped questioning myself. Fear creates self-doubt. It makes you second-guess instincts. Watching you, my instincts felt clearer, not louder, clearer. Clarity doesn't push, it settles. I trusted my perception because it was reinforced by what I witnessed. Your courage didn't make me idealize you. It made me see you realistically, and reality felt solid. There was no fancy to protect, no illusion to maintain, just a real person showing up with integrity. That's what made me certain, not because nothing could go wrong, but because nothing would be faced alone. I knew that if things became difficult, you wouldn't turn away. You wouldn't harden. You wouldn't disappear. You would stay present. Presence is the opposite of fear. Fear wants escape. Presence allows resolution. I didn't feel like I needed to prepare for impact anymore. I felt like I could stand still. And standing still is only possible when the ground beneath you feels stable. You were that ground. Not as a person to lean on, but as a presence that didn't shift under pressure. That's why your courage changed everything. It didn't make the future predictable. It made it workable. Workable futures don't require guarantees. They require trust. I trusted you, not blindly. Informed. That trust didn't feel risky, it felt aligned. And alignment removes fear quietly, without argument, without drama. You didn't try to convince me of anything. You didn't ask for belief. You simply showed up as yourself. That was enough. Once fear leaves, something else arrives. Commitment, not obligation. Commitment born from clarity. Clarity that says, this is worth building with. Not because it's easy, because it's real. If I didn't need courage for myself to stay, I had certainty, and certainty doesn't shake. Your courage gave me that, without asking, without intention, without effort. It changed everything because it removed the need to question what matters most. And when that happens, the future stops feeling heavy. It starts feeling honest. The kind of future that becomes possible because of it. There's a moment after certainty settles in where you stop thinking about what might happen. Not because you're avoiding the future, because you finally understand it. When fear leaves, imagination changes. It stops running ahead, predicting outcomes, rehearsing loss. It becomes quiet. And in that quiet, something else appears. Possibility, not fantasy, not hope. Possibility rooted in reality. Your courage didn't make me dream bigger. It made me think clearer. And clarity doesn't exaggerate, it simplifies. I stopped imagining dramatic futures. I stopped picturing turning points and grand moments. Instead, I started seeing something far more meaningful. Consistency. A future where conversations don't turn into battles. Where silence doesn't feel threatening. Where tension doesn't mean collapse. A future where both people stay present even when life stops cooperating. That kind of future isn't built on passion alone, it's built on character. And character is what your courage revealed. I realized something quietly. Most people talk about wanting safety. Very few know how to create it. Safety isn't about protection, it's about predictability of character, knowing how someone will behave when things get uncomfortable, knowing they won't abandon themselves or you to escape tension. That's what your courage offered. Reliability without rigidity, strength without control, presence without pressure. Those qualities don't fade over time, they deepen. I could see how a future with you wouldn't need constant maintenance. It wouldn't require reassurance loops or emotional negotiation. It would require attention, respect, deliberate care. That kind of future doesn't burn fast. It lasts. I stopped asking questions like, what if this changes? What if things get hard? What if we lose momentum? Not because those things won't happen, because I knew how we'd handle them. Handling matters more than avoiding. I realized that what people often call chemistry fades if it's not supported by courage. But courage doesn't fade. It strengthens under pressure. That's why your courage changed the entire trajectory. It turned uncertainty into something workable. I started noticing how my own behavior shifted. I wasn't guarding myself. I wasn't trying to stay one step ahead emotionally. I wasn't calculating timing or outcome. I was simply present. Presence is the clearest sign of trust, and trust allows intimacy to deepen naturally. Not rushed, not forced, naturally. I could see how difficult moments wouldn't become threats. They become conversations. Not conversations designed to fix. Conversations designed to understand. Understanding doesn't eliminate difference. It allows coexistence. A future built on courage doesn't require sameness. It allows individuality without fragmentation. I saw how space would exist. Healthy space, not distance. Room to think. Room to grow. Room to be human without fear of consequence. That's rare. And it only exists when courage replaces control. I realized how many futures fail not because people stop caring, but because they stop feeling safe enough to stay honest. Your courage made honesty possible, without demand, without expectation. Honesty that isn't demanded is honesty that lasts. I also saw something else. A future of growth doesn't feel threatening, where change doesn't signal stability, where evolution is welcomed instead of resisted. That only works when both people can remain grounded as things shift. You showed me you could. Grounded people don't panic when things change, they adapt, they recalibrate, they stay present. I knew that growth wouldn't pull us apart, it would refine us. That knowledge doesn't excite, it steadies. Steadiness creates longevity. I stopped thinking about forever in abstract terms. I started thinking in years, in seasons, in ordinary days that matter more than milestones. Mornings where silence feels comfortable. Evenings where conversations don't need to resolve everything. Moments where tension passes without damage. That's the future your courage made visible. Not dramatic. Durable. Durability is built quietly, in how people handle what doesn't go as planned, and how they treat each other when expectations aren't met, and how they respond when clarity takes time. You showed me that durability was possible. I realized that courage like yours doesn't just shape relationships. It shakes environments. It sets a tone. A tone where honesty is normal, where presence is expected, where avoidance doesn't thrive. That tone changes everything. I didn't imagine a future where nothing goes wrong. I imagined a future where nothing is avoided. Avoidance erodes connection. Courage preserves it. I saw how decisions would be made calmly, not impulsively, not out of fear, out of alignment. I saw how disagreements wouldn't threaten identity. They'd challenge understanding. I saw how trust wouldn't need constant reinforcement. It would exist as a baseline. That baseline changes how everything else functions. Your courage didn't make the future feel lighter. It made it feel solid. Solid enough to build on. Solid enough to rest on. Solid enough to grow within. I didn't feel like I had to prepare for loss. I felt like I could participate fully. Participation is only possible when fear steps aside. Fear didn't step aside because of reassurance. It stepped aside because of evidence. Evidence of how you show up. Evidence of your consistency. Evidence of your alignment. That's what changed everything. I also understood something personal. The reason your courage affected me so deeply is because it met me where I am, not where I used to be. I'm no longer interested in intensity without foundation. I'm no longer impressed by confidence without integrity. I'm no longer willing to trade peace for excitement. Your courage aligned with that. Alignment doesn't spark fireworks. It builds fires that last. I didn't feel pulled. I felt grounded. And grounding creates commitment naturally, not obligation, not fear-based attachment. Commitment rooted in clarity. I wasn't committing to outcomes. I was committing to process, to presence, to honesty. That's the kind of commitment that survives reality. I realized that the future no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something to walk into, together. Walking implies movement, but also pace, and courage sets a healthy pace. Not rushed, not stalled, deliberate. I knew that if we moved forward, it wouldn't be because we were swept up. It would be because we were aligned. The alignment began with courage. Yours, you didn't intend to change everything. You didn't try. You didn't even know you were doing it. But courage has that effect. It reorganizes reality quietly. It shifts what's possible. I don't see the future as fragile anymore. I see it as responsive. Responsive to integrity, responsive to presence, responsive to how we show up. And I know how you show up. That knowledge doesn't excite me. It steadies me. And steadiness is what allows something real to grow. Your courage didn't make promises. It made participation possible. And that's why it changed everything, not because it altered outcomes, because it made a future worth stepping into, one that doesn't need guarantees, just integrity. And I know you have that. Because I saw it when it mattered, when no one was watching, when it cost you comfort. Why? It became the moment that couldn't be unseen. There are moments in life that don't feel important when they happen. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with intensity or drama. They don't demand immediate response. They just sit there quietly, waiting to be understood. This is one of those moments. What you probably didn't realize is that courage like yours doesn't end when the situation passes. It lingers. It changes the way someone remembers you, the way they measure trust, the way they imagine the future. Long after the moment itself faded, what remained was clarity. Not emotional clarity, structural clarity. The kind that reorganizes how you see someone without effort. I didn't replay what you did over and over. I didn't analyze it. I didn't romanticize it. I simply understood something fundamental. You are someone who doesn't abandon yourself when it matters. That realization didn't come with excitement. It came with calm. And calm is the most honest signal of alignment there is. I stopped wondering how you'd show up under pressure. I already knew you wouldn't disappear. You wouldn't harden. You wouldn't perform strength or collapse into fear. You would remain present. Presence isn't flashy. But it's rare. And it's the one thing everything else depends on. I realized that many connections fail, not because people stop caring, but because they stop staying. They leave emotionally. They withdraw internally. They protect themselves by disappearing slowly. You didn't. You stayed whole. And wholeness is magnetic in a way. Intensity never is. That's when something irreversible happened. You crossed a line in my mind. Not a romantic one, a structural one. You moved from someone I feel connected to someone I trust under real conditions. That shift doesn't undo itself. I didn't need reassurance from you after that. I didn't need promises. I didn't need clarity spoken aloud. Your behavior already told the truth. I began to notice how different everything felt after. Conversations slowed down. Silence stopped feeling uncertain. Pauses didn't carry tension because I wasn't guessing anymore. Guessing is exhausting. Certainty is quiet. I noticed that I wasn't preparing for disappointment anymore. That doesn't mean I expected perfection. It means I expected presence. And presence is enough. Your courage didn't eliminate the possibility of difficulty. It eliminated the fear of being alone inside it. I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't holding on to hope anymore. Hope is fragile. It needs things to go well. What I felt wasn't hope. It was confidence. Not loud confidence. Grounded confidence. Confidence that comes from knowing how someone behaves when things are unresolved. That kind of confidence doesn't shake. I also realized how much your courage changed my standards. Not my expectations of you, my expectations of connection itself. I no longer valued intensity without integrity. I no longer respected decisiveness without self-awareness. I no longer confused chemistry with stability. Your courage clarified those things without words. That's what made it permanent. It didn't rely on emotion, it relied on observation. I saw how you didn't rush to define anything. And instead of creating uncertainty, that patience created trust. You weren't delaying, you were honoring reality. That distinction matters. People who delay are avoiding. People who honor reality are grounded. You were grounded. I understood then that your courage wasn't situational. It wasn't something you summoned. It was something you lived from. That kind of courage doesn't fade with time. It deepens. Because it's rooted in self-respect, not reaction. Self-respect doesn't negotiate with fear. It doesn't bargain with comfort. It stays. That staying changed everything. I stopped asking myself questions about the future, not because the future was clear, but because it felt trustworthy. Trustworthy futures don't promise ease. They promise integrity, and integrity is enough to build with. I saw how difficult moments wouldn't be dangerous. They'd be navigable, not because we'd avoid them, because we'd face them without losing ourselves. I realized how rare that is and how easily it's overlooked. Most people mistake courage for force. You showed me courage as restraint, as steadiness, as alignment. That version of courage doesn't burn out, it sustains. I also understood something else. Your courage didn't just affect how I saw you, it affected how I showed up. I became calmer, more deliberate, less reactive, because I wasn't responding to uncertainty anymore. I was responding to reality. Reality felt solid. I didn't feel the need to manage moments. I didn't feel the need to control outcomes. I didn't feel the need to protect myself. Protection is what you do when you expect collapse. I didn't expect collapse. Your courage removed the sense that things could fall apart suddenly. Not because nothing could go wrong, because nothing would be avoided. Avoidance is what causes collapse, not difficulty. You didn't avoid, and that's why things felt stable. I realized that courage like yours doesn't demand commitment, it earns it.